The shotgun in Baxter Graves's hand was not shaking from weakness. It was shaking because every acre of his old life had just been taken from him, and the only man standing close enough to blame was Percival Crane. The processing shed was silent, except for the low hum of drying screens and the faint scrape of dust across the concrete floor. On the table behind Percival, blank inventory sheets lay beside glass containers filled with saffron, red enough to look impossible in that dead valley. $21.4 million had just come out of land everyone mocked as worthless. Now Baxter stood in the doorway, red-eyed, dirty, hollowed out by the bank, the state, the drought, and his own pride. Percival kept both hands visible. One wrong breath could turn a miracle harvest into a crime scene. But what Baxter wanted was not money. It was the answer to a question no ruined man can say out loud. Nobody buys land in Cobra Valley expecting anything except failure. The locals will tell you that straight to your face, no apology, no softening of the blow. They have watched too many dreamers come through with their savings and their blueprints and their city confidence, and they have watched every single one of them leave with nothing but sunburn and regret. So when Percival Crane pulled his beat-up Chevy Silverado off the county road and stepped out onto 400 acres of the most degraded earth in the American Southwest, the verdict was already in before he had even closed the truck door behind him. The thermometer on the dashboard read 112 degrees. The landscape stretched out in every direction like something that had given up a long time ago. Bleached white caliche clay cracked into 1,000 jagged pieces. Scrub brush so dry, it looked like it had been dead for a decade. Heat mirages dancing on the surface of the ground, turning the horizon into something that shimmered and lied. This was a place where the sky itself felt hostile, where the sun did not so much shine as it pressed down, a physical weight on everything below it. Percival stood there in the heat and let it hit him. He was 42 years old with skin that had started to show the years in the lines around his eyes and the back of his neck, and the kind of quietness that settles into a man when he has made a decision so large and so irreversible that there is nothing left to do but stand in it. If you have ever done a job that fed your family while something inside you slowly went dark, you will understand why Percival Crane was standing in that particular desert on that particular morning. Not because he had nothing to lose, because he finally decided that what he was losing mattered more than what he was keeping. He had spent 15 years as a senior agronomist for one of the largest agricultural conglomerates in the Midwest. Good salary, good title, the kind of position men in his field spent careers chasing. His job was to squeeze the last possible yield out of exhausted land, and he was very good at it. He knew exactly which synthetic fertilizers would force a depleted field to produce for one more season, and he knew exactly what that field would look like 2 seasons after that. He had the data. He had watched it happen in real time, county by county, state by state. The land becoming dependent on the chemicals, the biology dying off the topsoil, thinning the yields, requiring more and more input to produce less and less output. He knew the system was consuming itself. He kept signing the approvals anyway. There was a memory that came back to him sometimes on the nights when the knowing sat heaviest. He was 16 years old, standing in the doorway of the kitchen in his family's farmhouse in Iowa. His father was sitting at the table, not eating, not talking, just looking out the window at the fields that were no longer theirs. A conglomerate had spent 2 years systematically undercutting the price of corn until the small operators could not survive, then swept in and bought the land at distressed prices. His father had signed the papers that afternoon. He sat at that kitchen table and looked out the window, and Percival stood in the doorway and did not know what to say, and the silence between them was the loudest thing he had ever heard. 30 years later, Percival understood the mechanics of exactly what had been done to his father. He understood it because he had become part of the machine that did it. The night he finally stopped was unremarkable on the surface. He was sitting in his office after midnight, looking at a satellite map of agricultural land degradation across the central United States. And he realized that the pattern spreading across that map was in part his work. He had made it more efficient. He had helped it move faster. He sat there for a long time. Then he went home, and in the morning he submitted his resignation and began the process of liquidating everything: his savings, his pension, his retirement accounts. $450,000. Every dollar he had accumulated in 15 years. He bought 400 acres of the cheapest, most destroyed land in Arizona for $50,000. The rest was for what came next. Word moved through Cobra Valley the way news always moves in small places fast and with additions. The diner on the main road became the unofficial clearinghouse for assessments of the situation. Men who had been farming this valley for decades sat over black coffee and agreed without much debate that the city suit who had bought the old Crenshaw parcel had probably lost his mind somewhere between here and wherever he came from. They gave him 6 months. Some of them were more generous than that. His nearest neighbor was Baxter Graves. 58 years old, built low and wide like something designed specifically for physical labor, with hands that looked like they had been roughed up by the land and then roughed up again. 3 generations of Graves men had worked the valley. Baxter ran 3,000 acres of alfalfa and cotton on water. He pulled from the aquifer beneath the valley floor, an aquifer that had been dropping steadily for years. He was not a man who talked much about the future, because the future in Cobra Valley had been a subject of quiet dread for long enough that most people had stopped raising it in polite company. Baxter drove his pickup to the fence line on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after Percival arrived and stood outside his truck watching Percival operate a rented excavator. What he saw made him stop and look for a long moment before he spoke. Percival was not cutting straight rows. He was carving a series of long, curving channels into the hardpan channels that followed the natural contour lines of the land, winding across the terrain in arcs and bends that followed no agricultural logic Baxter had ever seen. He called out over the noise of the diesel engine. Percival killed the machine and climbed down. Baxter looked at the trenches. He looked at Percival. He said with the genuine concern of a man who had seen too many people hurt themselves on this land, that whatever Percival was looking for out here, it was not in that dust bowl. The land had been dead since the 70s. Too much salt, too much clay. Not even the weeds wanted it anymore. Percival said he was not looking for anything. He was building something. Baxter waited. Percival pointed to the trenches and explained once the logic behind what he was doing. The channels were designed to function as water traps. Not for irrigation in the traditional sense, but for capture. Every drop of rain that fell on this property, instead of evaporating immediately or sheeting off the hardpan, would be caught by those channels and forced downward into the earth. The channels followed the contour lines of the land so that water slowed as it moved through them rather than accelerating toward a single exit point. Over time, the moisture would penetrate the caliche layer and begin to rehydrate the soil beneath. He was going to plant pioneer species in and around those trenches: desert mesquite, ironwood, desert acacia, trees that had root systems built for exactly this kind of hostile ground roots that could drive down through hardpan, pull nitrogen from the air and fix it into the soil, and over years create a canopy of shade that would drop the surface temperature in the trenches dramatically. Only beneath that canopy, once the microclimate had been established, would he plant what he actually came here to grow. Baxter listened to all of this without interruption. When Percival finished, Baxter looked at the trenches for a moment. Then he said that Percival was going to run out of money before the first tree reached knee height. He got back in his truck and drove away without looking back. There was no hostility in it. Not yet. What was in it was something Percival recognized and filed away because it would matter later. Baxter Graves had looked at those trenches the same way a man looks at something that quietly accuses him. Not of wrongdoing, of a different kind of knowing. Percival had spent one afternoon redesigning the hydrology of 400 acres of dead ground, and in doing so had implied without a single word about it that 58 years of traditional farming in this valley might have been working against the land rather than with it. That kind of thing does not sit comfortably with a man who has built his identity around his relationship with the earth beneath his feet. The next 4 months were the hardest physical work Percival had ever done in his life, and he had not come to Arizona expecting it to be easy. He spent the first 3 weeks finishing the trenches, working the excavator from first light until the heat became dangerous around 2 in the afternoon, then resting in the trailer until 6 and working by hand until dark. He installed 14 miles of drip irrigation tape along the trench lines connected to solar-powered pumps, drawing from a well he had drilled at the northwest corner of the property. He ordered 10,000 saplings, mesquite, and ironwood and acacia, and spent the following weeks planting them by hand in the loose compost he had mixed into the base of each trench. The summer that arrived was not a normal summer. The National Weather Service called it one of the hottest extended heat events in Arizona in recorded history. Temperatures broke 115 degrees on 6 consecutive days in July. The drip system kept the saplings alive, but barely, and there were sections in the lower trenches where the tape failed and the soil dried out faster than Percival could compensate for it. He hauled water by hand to those sections, carrying 5-gallon jugs across cracked earth in the full midday heat, his hands blistering on the plastic handles, his back announcing its objections in terms he could not ignore. He lost 11 pounds in July alone. He stopped looking in the mirror in the mornings because what he saw there was a man who was being consumed by the same landscape he was trying to restore. The money was bleeding out faster than his projections had allowed for. He had spent $50,000 on the land, another $100,000 on the excavator rental, the drilling equipment, the solar arrays, and the irrigation hardware. The saplings and compost had taken another $80,000. By August, he was working with $220,000 remaining and an operational burn rate that would exhaust those funds in approximately 4 months. Then Hadley Marsh came. Hadley was the branch manager of Desert Security Trust, the only banking operation with a physical presence in the Cobra Valley, and he was the kind of man who communicated his priorities through the details of his presentation. He arrived in an air-conditioned sedan, parked it on the gravel shoulder of the access road, and stood beside it in polished shoes that he clearly did not intend to dirty. He held a clipboard. He did not step off the gravel. Percival walked over to him, sweating through his shirt in the 108-degree afternoon. Hadley looked at the operational accounts which he had apparently been monitoring. He said the numbers were close to zero. He said the application for an agricultural extension loan had been reviewed by the board. He looked past Percival at the 400 acres of trenches and small struggling trees with the same expression a man uses when he reads a column of losses on a balance sheet. Then he said the board had denied the application. They did not finance suicide missions. Percival told him those trees were nitrogen fixers. He told him the surface temperature inside the trenches had already dropped 3 degrees, that he had measurements that the soil biology was beginning to recover from decades of death. He said he needed a bridge loan to reach the next planting phase. Hadley said they worked in yields, bushels per acre, pounds of beef per head. Percival had nothing to sell. If the equipment liens went into default, the bank would repossess the solar arrays before the end of the year. He said Percival should cut his losses and go back to the city. Then he got back in his sedan and drove away, and the cloud of pale dust that rose behind his tires was the most efficient summary of his opinion that he could have offered. Percival stood in the heat and watched it settle. He was not angry, which surprised him. What he felt was something more uncomfortable than anger. He understood Hadley's logic completely. It was exactly the same framework he had used for 15 years to evaluate land and investment and risk. It was the language of systems that extracted value and called that productivity. He had been fluent in that language for a long time. Hearing it spoken at him from the outside was a particular kind of instruction. He spent that evening sitting in front of the trailer as the heat finally released its grip on the day drinking water because he had given up alcohol for the sake of the work, and thinking about how close he actually was to the edge. The $220,000 would last until December if he was careful. The trees were alive. The trenches were holding moisture. But alive was not the same as viable, and viable was not the same as solvent. And the gap between where he was and where he needed to be was measured in time he did not have and money he did not possess. This was the lowest point, not dramatically, just quietly, persistently, the lowest the way a long slope becomes something you only recognize as a descent when you stop and look back at where you started. He went into town the next day for the first time in 3 weeks, mostly because his food supplies had run down to the level where ignoring them was no longer practical. The diner was the only place open that served hot food, and he sat at the counter and ordered without looking at the men at the other end who did not turn around to greet him. The woman who ran the place served him without conversation, which was fine. But her son, a young man of about 19 who was restocking the shelves behind the counter, watched Percival with an expression that was different from the others. Not dismissal, not hostility, something closer to genuine puzzlement. The young man said his name was Orson. He said he had seen the trenches from the road from a distance and that they reminded him of something. He said his grandfather used to talk about how water moved through the north part of the valley after a big rain back before the fields were all put in. How it spread out and slowed down instead of cutting straight to the creek. How the ground used to absorb it. Percival put down his fork and looked at him. He said his grandfather had told him that the valley used to hold water like a bowl before the plows came. Percival sat with that for a moment. Then he said that was exactly what he was trying to get it to do again. Orson nodded slowly, looking out the window at the flat, bleached distance beyond the glass. He did not say anything else, but he thought about it. Percival could tell by the way he stood there afterward, quiet, still facing the window, that he was turning something over in his mind that had not been there before. Percival drove back to the property in the late afternoon, and the desert was doing what it always did at that hour, holding the heat in the ground even as the sky began to shade toward orange. He sat on the step of the trailer and looked at the small green flags of the mesquite saplings visible across the nearest trenches, and he let himself think clearly about the probability of failure. Not as something to be pushed away, as a real thing to be examined. If he was wrong, he was not just going to lose the money. He was going to lose the argument. The argument he had been making since the morning he walked out of that office, the one that said the land could come back, that working with it rather than against it was not just idealism, but practical science. If Cobra Valley defeated him, it would be used as evidence. It would be cited. He had seen it happen to others. The system was very good at converting failure into cautionary tales. He was still sitting in there when the headlights appeared on the access road. A vehicle he did not recognize, moving slowly over the ruts. It stopped in front of the trailer, and a man got out, tall and thin, in a way that suggested he had never been entirely comfortable with the dimensions of his own body, with gray hair that went in several directions at once, and thick framed glasses that were slightly crooked on his face. He was wearing a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times the pattern had softened into something approximate, and he was carrying a canvas bag that clinked with the sound of glass. He looked at the trenches visible in the last of the evening light. He looked at Percival. He asked in a voice that was sharp and direct, and not unkind, whether Percival was the person trying to grow a forest in caliche clay. Percival said he was. He asked who wanted to know. The man said his name was Emery Finch, Dr. Emery Finch. Hydrologist, soil, microbiologist, and currently without academic affiliation, because the university that had employed him for 2 decades had determined that his research was incompatible with the interests of the chemical agriculture companies that funded their department. His work had demonstrated with sufficient evidence to satisfy rigorous peer review that synthetic fertilizer programs generated dependency in agricultural soil by suppressing the native biological networks that plants relied on for nutrition and water uptake. The companies that paid for the university's research chairs had not found this conclusion useful. The university had not renewed his contract. He had spent the last 2.5 years living out of his car, which was the station wagon currently parked on Percival's access road, conducting field research in locations that did not require institutional affiliation. In the back of that car, he had something he believed was directly relevant to what Percival was attempting to build. He reached into the canvas bag and set 3 glass jars on the trailer step beside Percival. Inside each jar was a dark liquid, almost black, moving slightly as it settled. He explained what it was in precise terms once because it was important and because he did not intend to repeat it. What he had cultured and concentrated over 18 months of fieldwork was a desert-adapted strain of mycorrhizal fungi, the same class of organism that formed the biological internet beneath healthy forest floors in environments far more forgiving than this one. When introduced to the root zone of a plant, this fungal network bonded with the root structure and extended its reach into the soil by a factor that conventional root systems could not approach. The result was a 400% increase in the plant's effective water absorption area, achieved without additional irrigation. More importantly, when multiple plants shared a fungal network, the larger root systems of the pioneer trees began to function as distribution infrastructure. The mesquite and ironwood roots going down 30 or 40 feet into the earth could pull water from deep below the callus layer and move it laterally through the fungal network to the shallower roots of smaller plants growing in the same trenches. The trees became pumps, the fungi became pipes. The whole system would function in ways that the dead, sterile caliche he was currently working with would never permit on its own. He looked at Percival steadily through the crooked glasses. He said the soil structure was right. The trenches were well designed. The pioneer tree selection was sound. But without the biological network, whatever Percival planned to grow beneath that canopy would burn up in the first serious heat event. Percival looked at the jars. He asked why Emery was offering this to him. Emery said that they had called him crazy. He wanted to prove them wrong. But he said there was a problem of timing. The pioneer trees needed years to mature fully, and Percival did not have years. What he needed was a cash crop that could generate revenue while the canopy was still developing, something that could survive in partial shade, that could thrive in the specific microclimate created by the trench system, and that could produce sufficient value per acre to justify the investment and keep the operation solvent until the full system came online. Percival was quiet for a moment. Then he went inside the trailer and came back with a rolled topographic map of the property and a single printed page with plant data on it. He set them on the trailer step under the porch light and pointed to a botanical name at the top of the page. Crocus sativus. Saffron. Emery looked at the name. He looked up at Percival. He looked out at the 400 acres of dark desert beyond the reach of the light. He said very carefully that Percival wanted to grow the most expensive legal crop on earth in the most hostile agricultural environment in the continental United States. Percival said that was correct. Emery was quiet for a long moment. The desert made its night sounds around them, the small dry wind moving through the scrub, the far-off call of something unseen. Then Emery sat down on the step beside the jars, took off his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt, and put them back on. He said that if it failed, Percival would lose everything. Not just the money, the credibility, the argument, the entire premise of what he was trying to demonstrate. Percival said he knew that. Emery said if it worked, what then? Percival looked out at the dark property, at the faint outline lines of the trench system he had built by hand over 4 months, at the small green lives he had kept alive through the worst heat the valley had seen in a generation. He thought about his father at the kitchen table. He thought about that satellite map and the spreading pattern of loss he had helped to make more efficient. He said then nobody gets to tell the next generation that dead land cannot be brought back. At 3:12 in the morning, in the cold silence that precedes a desert dawn, Percival Crane saw the first one. A single pale green spike no thicker than a matchstick pushing through the layer of wood chip mulch at the bottom of the nearest trench. He had been sitting beside it for 2 hours with a flashlight, not because he expected anything, but because he could not sleep and because the alternative was lying in the trailer, listening to his own doubt. Emery was 20 yards away doing the same thing at a different section, both of them hunched over the earth in the dark. Percival put the flashlight closer. The spike trembled slightly in a breath of air that moved through the trench. Then he saw another one 4 inches to the left. Then 3 more beyond that. He did not call out to Emery. He did not say anything at all. He set the flashlight down in the dirt and pressed both hands flat against the mulch on either side of the spike and stayed very still as if any movement might convince him he was wrong about what he was seeing. By 5 in the morning, when the first gray light began to define the eastern ridge, the trench in front of him had transformed. He stood up slowly, his knees aching from the hours on the ground, and looked down the length of the channel. Purple. Hundreds of crocus flowers opening in the thin pre-dawn light, each one pushing up through the dark mulch with the particular unhurried certainty of something that has been waiting underground for exactly the right moment. Each flower held 3 stigmas, thin as thread, and the color of deep red wine. Emery appeared at the edge of the trench. He looked down the channel and then along the other channels visible from where they stood, all of them showing the same impossible transformation. He started laughing, a real and unguarded sound that moved out across the dark desert and had nowhere to go but up. Percival did not laugh. He knelt down again and touched one of the flowers with the tip of his finger. The petal, thinner than anything, had a right to be in a place this hostile. He thought about his father, not in any articulate way, just the image of him sitting at that table looking out the window. He did not say anything about it. He stayed on his knees in the dirt for a while. Then he took out his phone and photographed the jars of harvested stigmas they had already begun collecting and sent the image to a number in Chicago. The response came in 11 minutes. A wire transfer notification for $50,000 appeared on his screen. He had beaten the bank. He had beaten the 30-day clock. He stood up in the growing light with $50,000 in an account that had been nearly empty the day before, and the trenches around him filled with something that had not existed in Cobra Valley until this morning. He had maybe 4 hours before the rising sun would begin to damage the delicate stigmas. They needed to harvest immediately. He smelled the smoke before he saw it. It was not the clean smell of a campfire or the distant chemical smell of someone burning trash. It was the particular thick smell of diesel accelerant meeting dry vegetation and it came from the south from the direction of the property line that bordered Baxter Graves's land. Percival turned and saw the orange line low on the horizon moving. The desert wind was pushing it north toward the trenches, toward the mulch and the pioneer trees, and the thousands of flowers that had just opened their petals for the first time. He had one clear thought before he started running. He had seen a man standing on the far side of the fence line in the early darkness before the blooms appeared a silhouette with something in his hand. He had not thought much of it then because Baxter had rights to his own land at any hour. Now he thought of it again, and the weight of what it meant settled over him with a clarity that had nothing to do with doubt. He ran toward the pump house, screaming Emery's name. Emery was already moving. He reached the main generator, grabbed the pull cord, and yanked it. Nothing. He yanked again, a hollow sputter and silence. The carburetor had flooded on the cold start. The fire line was crossing the property boundary now, feeding on the dry scrub beyond the first trench perimeter, and the wind was consistent and had no interest in cooperating. Percival did not stop running. He went past the pump house and past the equipment shed and reached the rented excavator parked at the northwest corner of the property. He climbed into the cab and turned the key, and the diesel engine fired immediately, loud and mechanical, and exactly what he needed. He did not hesitate. He drove the machine at full speed toward the emergency water storage tank positioned at the highest elevation point of the property, a 1,000-gallon gravity-fed reservoir he had built for the drought cycles he knew were coming. It was not designed for what he was about to use it for. He positioned the excavator bucket over the main outflow manifold at the base of the tank and drove it down hard. The PVC fitting shattered. The side of the tank tore open with a sound like a gunshot, and 1,000 gallons of water came out all at once, not as a trickle or a spray, but as a wall moving fast and purposeful down the slope. Because Percival had spent 3 months designing the contour of this property, because every trench and every berm and every grade change had been calculated to direct water where he needed it to go, the flood did not spread randomly. It hit the main arterial trench and divided splitting into the secondary channels with a precision that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with the months of work that had preceded this moment. The water reached the fire line at the edge of the mulch trenches, and the collision produced a massive eruption of white steam, a sound like a freight train passing close, and a curtain of vapor that whited out everything within 50 yards. Percival dropped out of the excavator cab and ran through the steam with his arms over his face, his lungs burning with the mixed smell of wet ash and scorched wood. The fire was gone. The mulch was soaked. The pioneer trees at the perimeter were burned, the young ironwoods and acacias he had planted with his own hands, in the first weeks gone to blackened sticks. But the trenches had held. He reached the nearest channel and looked down through the clearing, steam, and felt his stomach drop. The water was pooling deep nearly to the lip of the trench, and the crocus flowers, the ones that had opened an hour ago in the darkness, were submerged to their stems. Emery arrived beside him at a run, soot-streaked, his glasses fogged from the steam. He did not need to explain the problem. Saffron corms drowned. A flood of this depth for more than a few hours would rot them in the ground. They had saved the flowers from the fire, and they were going to lose them to the water. They grabbed shovels from the equipment shed. For the next 3 hours, working in mud that sucked at their boots, in heat that came from both the sun above and the still warm earth below, they cut breaches in the lower retaining walls of each trench, letting the accumulated water drain out into the open desert beyond the property. It was brutal and repetitive, and there was nothing to say while they did it, so neither of them said anything. When the last excess water had drained, Percival collapsed onto his back in the mud and looked straight up at the Arizona sky. It was the hard, flat blue of late morning, cloudless and different. Beside him in the trench, 1,000 crocus flowers lay battered and coated in fine silt. But they were standing. The stems had not broken. The root structures, reinforced by the fungal network below, had held the corms in place through the flood. He lay in the mud for a while. Then he sat up and looked toward the fence line on the south side of the property. He said quietly to no one in particular that they were now officially at war. He drove to the county sheriff's office that afternoon. Ingmar Coburn was a man who communicated his relationship with conflict through stillness, through the deliberate, unhurried quality of his movements, through a willingness to let silence do work that other men filled with words. He heard Percival out. He chewed on a toothpick. He looked at the charred scrub on the far side of the property line that Percival described, which Coburn had not yet visited personally. Then he said that August in Arizona was fire season. That lightning cigarettes thrown from passing trucks, a dozen ordinary things could start a ground fire in conditions like these. He said that Baxter Graves had 3 ranch hands who confirmed he was in the equipment barn all morning working on a failed hydraulic line. Percival said he had seen a man at the fence line before the fire started. Coburn said Percival had seen a silhouette in the dark. He said the law required more than a silhouette. Percival said that Coburn was protecting Baxter because Percival was an outsider. Something shifted in Coburn's expression, then not softening but sharpening a line drawn. He said he was protecting the law, which required evidence which Percival did not have. He said if he received another call from either property about a confrontation between the two men, he would make arrests and sort out the details from there. He said it without raising his voice. Outside, Emery was leaning against the vehicle. When Percival came out, Emery said he had done some research on the county financial records, which were public documents. He said that Ingmar Coburn carried a personal loan from Desert Security Trust originated 3 years ago with Hadley Marsh listed as the managing officer. He said this was not necessarily evidence of anything corrupt. He said it was context. Percival got in the vehicle. He said they were going to win this the only way left. He said Coburn could have his law, and Hadley could have his ledger, and Baxter could have his alibi. He said they were going to make it impossible for any of those things to matter. The harvest took 4 days and cost them more physical effort than anything either man had done in the operation to that point. Collecting saffron stigmas required a precision that could not be rushed. Each flower approached individually, each set of 3 threads removed with tweezers and placed without crushing into sterile glass containers. They worked from before first light until the sun climbed high enough to risk wilting the flowers, then sheltered during the midday heat and returned in the late afternoon. Emery had converted the trailer interior into a drying operation. Fine mesh screens suspended above low-heat infrared lamps. The temperature held at a precise 110 degrees to drive off moisture without destroying the volatile oils that gave the spice its value and its chemical identity. When they weighed the dried yield, the scale read 38 pounds. Percival sent the shipment to a freight forwarder in Phoenix the following morning. Neither of them spoke much during the wait that followed. There was a specific quality to it that made words feel unnecessary and slightly absurd. The call came on a Tuesday. The voice on the other end belonged to Crispin Boyd, the luxury commodity broker in Chicago, who had been Percival's point of contact for the past 3 months. Crispin was not a man who expressed surprise easily or often. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone choosing each word after considering the alternatives. He said that his laboratory had completed the chemical analysis of the shipment. He said the crocin level, the compound that determined color strength and grade classification, had registered at 290 on the ISO scale. He said that ISO grade 1, the highest commercial classification in the world required a minimum of 190. He said that Percival's product did not merely meet the grade 1 standard. He said it exceeded every sample he was currently sourcing from established growing regions in Iran and Spain by a margin that his laboratory technicians had initially assumed indicated an equipment error. They had run the analysis 3 times. The number was correct each time. He said he was prepared to wire the balance for the 38 pounds at the agreed rate of $1,500 per ounce. He said he was also prepared to discuss terms for an exclusive supply contract covering the expanded production Percival had described in their earlier conversations. Percival sat at the small folding table in the trailer and listened to Crispin's measured voice describe a number that represented more money than he had earned in any 2-year period of his professional life. When Crispin finished, Percival thanked him and said he would call back within the week to discuss contract terms. He ended the call. He sat there for a moment. He looked at the drying screens where the last of the stigmas were finishing their cure. He looked at Emery, who was watching him from across the trailer. He said, "We broke the system." Emery looked back at him with an expression that mixed genuine satisfaction with the particular caution of a scientist who had been celebrating too early before. He said he was glad. Then he said they should probably think carefully about what comes next, because what they had just done was now visible. Invisible success in a controlled market attracted exactly the kind of attention that had ended both of their previous careers. He was right, and the evidence arrived sooner than either of them expected. 3 weeks after the wire cleared, a woman named Evelyn Stokes drove onto the property in a white state vehicle with 2 technicians and a stack of equipment cases in the back. She was 47 years old with the composed manner of someone who had delivered difficult news in difficult places, often enough that neither the news nor the place affected her posture anymore. She was the senior agricultural inspector for the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality. She presented Percival with a formal notice of investigation. Baxter Graves had filed a complaint alleging that Percival's deep trenching had unlawfully altered the subterranean hydrology of the valley, effectively stealing aquifer water from adjacent properties. He had also alleged that the biological inoculation program used on the property involved an unapproved invasive organism that posed a contamination risk to the regional water table. Emery came out of this processing shed and read the notice over Percival's shoulder. His jaw tightened. He said quietly that the organism in question was Glomus intraradices, a naturally occurring soil fungus present in healthy farmland across the world. The idea that it constituted a biological contaminant was, in his professional opinion, the kind of claim that only made sense if someone had never read the peer-reviewed literature or had read it and was deliberately misrepresenting it. Evelyn said she was not there to evaluate claims. She was there to conduct a hydrological survey and collect soil samples for laboratory analysis. During the investigation, all pumping operations would be suspended. She said it without apology and without particular sympathy. It was a procedure and she was following it. Percival asked how long the suspension would last. She said it depended on laboratory processing times, typically 5 to 7 days. 5 days without the pump system meant the expanded planting zones where the corms he had just purchased were scheduled to go in the ground would begin to suffer within 72 hours. Percival looked out at the trenches and calculated what could be kept alive by hand and what could not. The numbers were not encouraging. That night, after Evelyn's team had established their equipment and set up camp near the main well access point, Percival and Emery moved through the property in the dark with buckets and hand pump equipment, watering the most vulnerable sections by hand. They worked until 2 in the morning. They were back at it by 5. On the 6th morning, Evelyn Stokes walked across the property alone. No technicians, no clipboard. She was carrying a manila folder, and she moved with the deliberate step of someone who has been sitting with information for a day and is still working out how to present it. She stopped in front of Percival and Emery and looked at the trenches for a moment before she spoke. She said she had been an agricultural inspector for 22 years. She said she had reviewed hundreds of hydrological surveys for properties across the state, in drought zones and floodplains, and everything in between. She said she had never seen a report like the one her team had produced for this property. She opened the folder and showed them the topographic map. The color-coded groundwater data showed something that contradicted every element of Baxter Graves's complaint. The aquifer beneath the Crane property had not dropped. It had risen 4 inches in 6 months, and the water was not contained beneath the property line. It was bleeding outward, replenishing the surrounding zones. The deep trench system, combined with the organic mulch layer and the developing root networks, had created a biological sponge that was capturing surface water at a rate that was measurably increasing the regional groundwater supply. Percival was not draining the valley's water. He was putting it back. Emery let out a single sharp sound and pressed his hand over his mouth. Evelyn continued, "The soil samples showed no invasive contamination. The fungal cultures present in the trench zones were consistent with naturally occurring mycorrhizal communities found in healthy desert ecosystems. The carbon sequestration data was, according to her laboratory director, the highest ever recorded for an agricultural site in the state of Arizona. She said all violations had been cleared. Operations could resume immediately." She folded the map and returned it to the folder. Then she paused. She said that as part of the regional survey, her team had also run telemetry on the neighboring wells, including those on the Graves property. She said the results showed that Baxter Graves had been operating his irrigation system with the state-mandated flow restrictors bypassed for a period of at least 3 years. The volume of water he had extracted during that time exceeded his permitted allocation by a significant margin. The state would be issuing a formal cease and desist order and initiating proceedings for remediation costs. She said this with the same flat professional tone she had used throughout. Then she got in her vehicle and drove back toward the county road. Percival stood in the morning sun and looked at the property around him. The trenches, the trees, the dark living earth that had been white caliche when he arrived. He thought about Baxter filing that complaint, the particular desperation of a man who had watched the ground beneath his operation fall away year by year and had found someone to blame for what was actually a long, slow consequence of the choices made before either of them arrived. He did not feel satisfaction about what was coming for Baxter. He felt something closer to sorrow. He needed corn stock for 3,000 acres of expanded planting. The saffron corn market was dominated by licensed producers in Spain and growers in Iran. Percival had been negotiating a bulk purchase through Crispin Boyd for 2 months, and the pricing had been agreed. He was waiting on the shipping confirmation. When Crispin called, the tone of his voice was controlled in the way a person is controlled when they are working to keep their voice from doing something else. He said the Spanish consortium had withdrawn from the contract. A purchasing entity operating through a series of corporate subsidiaries had moved through the global saffron corn market over the preceding 2 weeks and acquired the available commercial surplus at prices significantly above market rate. The corms had been transported to a cold storage facility and destroyed. The name of the entity at the end of the ownership chain was a subsidiary of Apex Agricorp. Percival set the phone down on the table and did not pick it up again for a while. Apex Agricorp controlled the majority of the world's synthetic fertilizer patent portfolio. Their entire business model depended on the continued dominance of chemical agriculture. What Percival and Emery had built was not, from Apex's perspective, a small desert farm. It was proof of concept. If it scaled, if it got documented and replicated and taught, it had the potential to make a significant portion of what Apex sold unnecessary. Jarrett Pruitt arrived the following Monday. He came in an armored SUV that ignored the new security gate by simply going around it through the adjacent scrub. He was 49 years old, dressed in a way that communicated expense without drawing attention to it, and he had the eyes of a person who had negotiated under conditions of deliberate pressure, often enough that it had become his default state. He introduced himself as the Vice President of Acquisitions for Apex Agricorp. He said he was not there to discuss saffron. He said that the state hydrological report, which had been filed as a public document, had attracted significant interest. Apex was prepared to offer $30 million for the property, the land rights, and an exclusive license to the fungal inoculation process. Emery came out of the processing shed. He said he knew exactly what Apex would do with the research. He said they would bury it. The biological network made their entire chemical product line unnecessary, and they had the market position and the regulatory relationships to ensure that a technology this threatening to their revenue base would never reach the people who needed it. Pruitt looked at Emery without changing his expression. Then he looked back at Percival. He said $30 million was not a negotiation. It was an exit. He said the alternative was competing with a company that controlled the supply chains, the political relationships, and the legal resources to make a small Arizona operations existence very difficult for a very long time. Percival said he had survived the desert. He said he had survived the fire. He said Pruitt was a man with a checkbook in a suit. He told him to get off his land. Pruitt looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up his briefcase and walked back to the SUV. Before he got in, he said one thing. He said that by the end of the year, he expected to be buying the property at a foreclosure auction for a fraction of what he had just offered. He drove away. Emery stood beside Percival and said they should assume Pruitt meant every word of it. They were right to assume it. 2 weeks later, Crispin Boyd called again. The last remaining source of commercial saffron corn stock had just signed an exclusivity agreement with an Apex subsidiary. The global commercial supply was effectively closed. Baxter Graves was sitting outside the trailer when Percival came out after the call. He had been appearing at the property with increasing frequency since the state had issued its cease and desist on his own operation. He did not ask permission, and Percival did not offer it. Baxter simply turned up, sitting in the dust outside the trailer, or walking the trench lines with the expression of a man who has nowhere specific to be and is not ready to admit what that means. Percival told him about the corn situation without framing it as anything other than what it was. Baxter listened. He spit a stream of chewing tobacco into the dirt. He said that Pruitt thought he controlled the world because he could buy the registered markets. He said farmers had been moving seed across borders since before there were borders worth talking about. He said he knew a man in Montreal, a commodity importer, who had operated for years in the unregistered agricultural trade. who had sourced high-altitude cashmere saffron corms from growers who had never appeared on any global commodity index. Apex had not touched them because Apex did not know they existed. Percival said he had $400,000 in operational reserves remaining. Baxter said to make the call. The risk was real, and they both understood it. Corms carrying a fungal pathogen could devastate the biological network Emery had spent 18 months building. The Montreal contact could disappear with the money. A customs seizure would expose Percival to federal agricultural import violations. These were not hypothetical dangers. They were concrete possibilities, each one sufficient on its own to end everything. Percival thought about the alternatives. There were none. 3 unmarked refrigerated semi-trucks rolled down the dirt access road of Cobra Valley at 2 in the morning, running dark except for their running lights. Baxter walked to the lead truck and unbolted the rear door. Inside, stacked in wooden crates to the ceiling, were 22 million saffron corms from the high-altitude growing regions of Kashmir, bruised from the journey and slightly dehydrated but alive. The smell of them filled the cold night air, dense and particular, the smell of something that had traveled a very long way to be exactly here. Percival stood at this open door of that truck in the 2 in the morning dark of a desert he had spent nearly a year trying to bring back to life, and he understood that what came next was not a farming decision. It was all or nothing played out in the dirt, and they had 10 days before the heat dried those corms to dust. He looked at Baxter standing beside him and said they needed every hand the valley could provide. Baxter said he knew. He said he had already made some calls. Orson showed up at the gate at 5 in the morning with his mother's pickup and a thermos of coffee, and he was not alone. There were 11 people behind him. A retired mining engineer named Gus, who had worked the copper operations north of the valley for 30 years, and whose hands were still strong enough to do serious work. A high school biology teacher named Patricia, who had driven 40 minutes from the next town over because Orson had called her the night before and described what was happening in the terms she found impossible to ignore. 2 brothers who ran an auto shop in town, neither of whom had any particular interest in agriculture, but both of whom understood that what Apex AgriCorp represented was the same thing that had killed their father's hardware store 15 years ago when the chain stores moved in, and 7 others who had heard through the valley's informal network that a man was about to lose everything to a company that had already taken enough from this community and who had come because that was reason enough. By 7 in the morning, there were 60 people at the gate. By 9, there were over 200. Percival stood at the entrance and watched them come and did not know what to say. Orson came and stood beside him with the thermos and poured him a cup of coffee without being asked, and said that people in the valley had been watching the property for months. He said they had seen the trenches go in and the trees go up and the ground change color. He said his grandfather had told him what this valley used to look like, and he said that some of the older people who came today remembered it themselves. Baxter organized the work with the efficiency of a man who had spent decades directing large-scale agricultural operations. He divided the arrivals into teams, assigned each team a section of trench, and walked each group through the planting depth and spacing that Emery specified. Emery moved between teams with a spray tank of the inoculation solution, treating each planting zone before the corms went in. Percival worked the sections closest to the existing trench infrastructure. For 10 days from before dawn until the light failed, the valley worked. There was something in it that Percival had not anticipated and could not have planned for. The people who came were not there because of the money, though he paid, every one of them, $20 an hour in cash drawn from the operational reserve. They were there because of something older and less articulable, a relationship with land that most of them had grown up inside and watched erode over the course of their lifetimes. A retired woman named Eunice, who had farmed wheat with her husband for 30 years before the water costs made it impossible, told Percival on the 4th day, while they worked side by side in a trench section, that she had not gotten her hands in the ground in 7 years. She said she had forgotten what it felt like to be doing something real. He kept working. On the 7th day, Baxter drove the lead excavator himself for 16 hours without stopping, except to refuel, cutting new access channels through the sections of the expansion that the original trench system had not yet reached. He worked with the focused intensity of a man trying to finish something before he had to think too hard about what it meant that he was doing it at all. On the 10th day they finished. 22 million corms in the ground covered with mulch connected to a fungal network that Emery described in his field notes as the largest intentional mycorrhizal inoculation of a desert agricultural site in the documented history of the discipline. The pioneer trees, now 8 to 12 feet tall, spread their canopy over the new planting zones. The biological infrastructure was in place. They were 2 weeks into November, and the desert had one more thing to say. The warning came through the local weather service at 11 at night, a forecast update that moved the projected overnight low from 28 degrees Fahrenheit to 14. Not a frost, a hard freeze driven by a polar vortex that had displaced Arctic air straight south into the American Southwest. At 28 degrees, the saffron corms would survive. At 14 degrees, the pioneer trees, the mesquite and acacia and ironwood that had spent 10 months building the canopy and root infrastructure the entire system depended on, would not. Percival read the forecast on his phone standing outside the trailer in the dark. The temperature had already dropped to 31 and was falling. He could feel it in the air, a different quality of cold from the normal desert nights, something with weight and intention behind it. He went inside and woke Emery, who read the forecast and sat on the edge of his cot for a moment without speaking. Then he said that without the canopy, the microclimate in the trenches would not survive the morning sun. The corms would bloom, but the stigmas would be destroyed by the heat and ultraviolet exposure before they could be collected. 3 months of preparation, 22 million corms, the labor of 200 people over 10 days. All of it producing a harvest that would wilt before anyone could touch it. Percival went outside again. Baxter was sitting on an overturned bucket near the equipment shed, awake watching the sky. The stars were extraordinarily clear in the cold, the kind of clarity that comes when the air has been scrubbed of everything that softens it. Baxter said he had been thinking. He said the deep aquifer wells drew water from 500 feet down from a geological layer insulated by the earth above it. That water came up at a constant temperature regardless of surface conditions. He said that temperature was 68 degrees Fahrenheit, and that 68 degrees discharged as a fine spray mist into 14-degree air would produce a thermal fog, a physical cloud of warm vapor across the entire property. Percival followed the logic to where it was going. Emery appeared in the doorway of the trailer. He provided the physics in a single sentence. Water releases heat as it freezes. And if that freezing happens on the surface of a leaf, rather than inside the leaf tissue, the exothermic reaction holds the leaf's internal temperature at 32 degrees, rather than allowing it to drop to the temperature of the ambient air. The ice itself became insulation. Citrus growers in Florida had used the principle for generations. The question was whether they had the pump capacity to atomize enough water to cover 3,000 acres. Baxter said they were going to find out. They ran. Percival and Baxter hit the pump house doors together, and Baxter went straight to the main control panel and bypassed the safety regulators, pushing the industrial pump array into ranges they were rated for, but never intended to run at continuously. The pipes shuddered. The pump housings began a low-frequency vibration that Percival could feel through the soles of his boots. Across 3,000 acres, high-pressure impact sprinklers activated simultaneously. The sound was enormous and immediate, a roaring hiss that filled the cold air from fence line to fence line. The warm water met the 14-degree air, and the condensation was instantaneous. Within 3 minutes, a white fog bank was building over the entire property, not a ground mist, but a dense, opaque cloud that rose 15 feet off the earth and held. The temperature inside the fog layer stabilized. Outside the property boundary, the desert floor continued to drop. Inside the cloud, the instruments read 31 and held there as the water continued to spray and freeze and release its heat in a continuous cycle. The three of them climbed to the roof of the processing shed and sat up there in thermal blankets and watched. The canopy of the pioneer trees disappeared beneath the fog within minutes. The sprinkler noise was steady and relentless. Every 10 minutes or so, there was the sound of a branch giving way under the accumulating weight of ice, a sharp crack that moved through the cold air like a warning. Each time it happened, Percival made himself count to 5 and not speak. The pumps ran for 8 hours. At 6:30 in the morning, as the sun began to clear the eastern ridge, Baxter shut the main feeds. The spray died away. The fog thinned slowly as the sun climbed, and then it began to fall back toward the earth. What it revealed looked like the end of something rather than the beginning. The 3,000 acres of pioneer trees were encased in ice, every branch and twig and leaf encoded in a solid glittering shell, The canopy bowed under the accumulated weight into shapes that seemed structurally impossible. The only sound was the slow dripping as the ice began to release, and beneath the dripping, a deep silence. The silence of a thing that has been through tremendous stress and is not yet sure whether it has survived. Baxter climbed down from the roof and walked to the nearest mesquite tree and used his pocket knife to chip through the ice casing around a cluster of leaves near the base of the tree where the coating was thinnest. The leaves underneath were green, not damaged, not discolored, a clean, healthy green. He did not say anything. He looked at Percival and gave a single nod. The bloom began at 9 in the morning. It did not happen the way the first bloom had happened, quietly in the dark, one flower at a time. This happened at scale. The thermal shock of the freeze transmitted through the fungal network to 22 million corms simultaneously triggered a synchronized emergence across the entire expanded planting. By 10 o'clock, the trenches across all 3,000 acres were transforming. By noon, commercial aircraft flying the Phoenix to Las Vegas corridor were logging reports of an unusual visual phenomenon over the desert northeast of Cobra Valley. A purple mass large enough to be visible from 30,000 feet had appeared overnight in a location where satellite imagery showed bare desert 2 weeks prior. Crispin Boyd flew in from Chicago and walked the trenches himself, his expensive shoes completely destroyed within the first hour, and he did not appear to notice or care. He stood in one of the main channels and looked down its length at the purple extending to the horizon and said nothing for a long time. The harvest required 1,000 people. Percival hired the county. They came. Retirees and students and people who had never set foot on agricultural land in their lives crawled through the shaded trenches in the cool microclimate that the canopy still provided, working with tweezers and glass containers, moving carefully and methodically through the purple field. The processing sheds ran 24 hours a day for 6 days. The smell of the operation, that dense and specific aroma of pure saffron at industrial volume, drifted across the valley for a week. When Crispin's laboratory in Chicago completed the final yield analysis, he called Percival on a Thursday afternoon. Percival was in the main shed doing inventory. He put the call on speaker. Crispin has said the average yield across the expansion was 22 pounds per acre. He said this figure was not possible according to any existing agricultural model for saffron production under any known growing conditions. His laboratory director had contacted 3 independent agronomists to review the methodology before he was willing to put a number on the report. All 3 had confirmed the data. He said the number. The total gross revenue for the harvest was $21.4 million. Percival stood in the main shed with the inventory sheet still in his hand and let that number exist in the air for a moment. $21.4 million. From a piece of ground that an entire valley had written off, expanded to 3,000 acres, with the labor of an entire community running on water and fungi in the careful design of the earth itself. Crispin said the financial news had already reached the commodity trading sector. Apex Agricorp stock had taken a measurable decline, and institutional investors began reassessing the long-term viability of the chemical fertilizer market in light of what the Cobra Valley data represented. Jarrett Pruitt had been placed on administrative leave by the Apex board, pending a review of the acquisition strategy that had included the corn market manipulation, which had generated enough documentation to attract the attention of agricultural regulators in 3 states. Percival thanked him and ended the call. He stood alone in the shed for a while. The inventory sheets were still in his hand. He set them down. He was still standing there when the shed door opened. Baxter Graves had lost weight since Percival had last looked at him carefully. Not the purposeful kind, the inadvertent kind, the kind that happens when a person has stopped eating regularly because eating requires a level of engagement with the future that they can no longer sustain. His clothes were dirty. His eyes were red at the rims. He smelled of cheap whiskey, not strongly but unmistakably. And Percival had the clear understanding that this was not a social call, and that the object in Baxter's right hand held low against his leg was a 12-gauge shotgun. He raised it when he saw Percival looking at it. His hands were not steady. He said that Percival had taken everything. He said Percival had come into his valley with his ideas and his money and his outside knowledge, and had taken the life that 3 generations of Gravesmen had built from nothing, and that the bank had come that morning and changed the locks on the farmhouse that his grandfather had built with a mule and a post-hole digger, and that there was nothing left of any of it. Percival did not move. He kept his hands visible and his voice at a register that did not add anything to what was already in the room. He said he had not taken anything from Baxter. He said the aquifer had been going down for 20 years before Percival arrived. He said the way Baxter had farmed was the way everyone in the valley had farmed because it was the only method anyone had taught them, and it was a method that extracted more than the land could replace, and the result of that method applied long enough was always the same result regardless of how hard the person farming was working or how much they deserved a different outcome. Baxter said to shut up. Percival said he was not going to shut up because if Baxter pulled that trigger, he was going to spend the rest of his life in a federal prison and the bank was still going to own the land, and the Graves name was going to end in a concrete cell, and that was the only outcome available to him if this conversation went the direction Baxter had come here to take it. The barrel of the shotgun was shaking. Baxter said there was no legacy left anyway. He said it was gone and Percival had taken it. Percival took a slow step forward, not aggressive, deliberate. He said he was going to buy the Graves property from the bank. He said he was going to pay off the full debt, clear the liens, and take possession of the 3,000 acres. He said he needed a foreman. He said the expansion he was planning for the following year would require someone who knew how to move earth on a large scale, who knew the valley's weather patterns, the supply networks, the behavior of the heavy equipment that a project of this size required. He said Baxter knew every one of those things better than Percival would ever know them, and that knowledge was worth something real in the context of what was being built here. Baxter stared at him. He said after everything, after all of it. Percival said that what Baxter knew about this land was not erased by what he had done with it. He said the valley was going to come back, and it was going to come back faster and better, with someone who had spent 58 years learning its particular character, working on the side of the process rather than against it. He said Baxter could pull the trigger and remove himself from every possible future, or he could put the gun down and be part of the one that was coming. The shed was completely silent for what felt like a long time. The shotgun came down, not slowly, not with any ceremony. It just came down and then it fell because Baxter's hands released it entirely before he had made the intentional decision to let it go, and it hit the concrete floor of the shed with a sound that was very loud and then was over. Baxter went to his knees. He put his face in his hands, and the sound that came out of him was the sound of a man who had been holding himself together through force of will for longer than that kind of effort can be sustained and had finally stopped. Percival crossed the shed and put his hand on Baxter's shoulder and left it there. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the moment did not already contain. The paperwork was finalized on a Tuesday morning in the office of the regional